what are the stakes first for Christians if the resurrection isn't true? I think that's very important to discuss. I think it's often neglected, is anything we do amounts to nothing. Christians are really the ultimate deceivers. Humanity is really still trapped. We're still waiting for someone to save us, or maybe there isn't anyone to save us if the resurrection isn't true. Humans are to be pitied, but most particularly Christians are to be pitied. A lot of modern Christians sometimes turn towards this view that, oh, the resurrection wasn't literal, it was really more, it was like a spiritual resurrection that Jesus showed that we can overcome death. But really, in order to overcome death, one really has to actually die. And the effect of original sin is that people die. And if Jesus assumed human nature to save us from this fallen human nature, it would really make sense that this resurrection would be physical. Not to mention that the Greek words used in both Paul's epistles and the Gospels themselves makes it very clear that this is a literal, physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, did Jesus even exist in the first place? We discussed the Gospel timeline already, but a few other extra biblical sources that might be helpful in seeing as to why Jesus was a real historical figure. So Josephus writes in around 90 AD about Christians themselves. He was not Christian, he was a rabbi, Jewish rabbi, but he still writes about the Christians in two notable passages, one of which is often disputed among scholars as to whether it's authentic or whether there was later Christian interpolation. But I think that it's important to note that that's really only one of the passages, that the other passage in Josephus that references Christians is not at all disputed. It's very clearly an original authentic source, although I do think that there were Christian interpolations, that the original text still had these two references to Christians. It was just about what Christians believe, and presumably Josephus would have consulted people that either they themselves were present at the life of Jesus or knew someone directly. Another person is Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. These are two Roman historians who wrote about the beliefs of Christians. They themselves were not there at the time, but it's very clear that this notion of a physical resurrection from this rabbi in Jerusalem was the belief from the very beginning of Christianity. And then Lucian and Suetonius, a bit later, sort of Roman scholars, though Suetonius, I believe, writes a comedy about Christians. And the other thing, another source that's more oral, you might see, if the slides were shown earlier, that it's around 480 to 500, one of the sources I cite, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. Why would that be? Why would I cite the Babylonian Talmud? Well, for two reasons. It was oral tradition, and oral tradition was, once again, a credible thing. But even if we look at the earliest sort of sources regarding the Jewish response to the resurrection, this claimed resurrection, it was very skeptical, one, and two, they provided alternate explanations, such as that Jesus' body was stolen from the tomb, that it was buried in the garden near his tomb, and all these things presuppose an empty tomb, but it wasn't codified until around 500 AD. But at the time, when Christians were beginning to sort of gain more prominence, the Jews had a sort of a council, if you will, as to whether Christians should be accepted as Jews, and they later said no, for this reason, that they believed that Jesus was not only Messiah, but was indeed the Son of God. So here are the 5 possible theories that will be discussed as to what people generally think happened with Jesus. So the first theory is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. So the swoon theory, Jesus died, but he didn't actually rise. The apostles were just liars. Third, that Jesus did die, but the apostles were deceived themselves, so they just hallucinated maybe. Jesus died. Jesus didn't rise though, and because the apostles had dedicated so much of their life to Jesus, they just made something up. So conspiracy and myth are very similar, and they kind of transformed Jesus into this mythical person who he wasn't actually. And then the fifth possibility is that Jesus died and Jesus actually did resurrect, and that's Christianity. I'm going to go through each of them, sort of examining sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each argument, and then at the end sort of come to a conclusion as to what the most logical claim seems to be. So the swoon theory, in my opinion, is certainly the weakest theory, that maybe Jesus just didn't die. He just fainted on the cross maybe, or they switched Jesus out with someone else. One of the common theories is, Simon of Cyrene was placed in place of Jesus. So basically the Romans somehow failed to execute Jesus, and but that would be really odd for two reasons. The Romans are really, really good at executing people. They were known for it in the ancient world. And the other thing is, the soldiers who had been placed, who had been told to execute Jesus, they themselves would have faced very severe punishment, likely involving torture or death, had they failed to execute this criminal. Now, Jesus wasn't a criminal according to Roman law, but was indeed subject to the death penalty under Jewish law. But since the Jews were subject to the Romans at this point in time, it was the Romans who had to carry out all executions. So Jesus certainly would have died. I mean, even if he didn't die, and there's some merit to this, I like to put it this way. Suppose you had someone who's fainted or was at this point put into shock and went into coma, and then they were put inside of a tomb that was shut by a heavy stone, and it didn't have food, water, or any sort of medical treatment for 3 days. The chances of that person living, that would be pretty miraculous in and of itself, I would say. And crucifixions were notoriously long. That's why they were so barbaric. So most crucifixions lasted a few days, with some lasting up to a week or even 2. But Jesus died in about 6 hours, and there's a lot of reasons for this, such as the excessive torture that took place before the actual crucifixion itself. But given the Romans' reputation for being great at executing people, you would think that they would know that Jesus was dead. That's why they were surprised that Jesus died so quickly, so they thrust a lance or a spear into his side, and blood and water flows out, and they didn't break his legs because it was just so clear that Jesus had died at this point. So the swoon theory doesn't seem to have a lot of evidence supporting it. The next theory is the conspiracy theory, which is that Jesus didn't really rise. Just the apostles were really upset. They had invested their 3 years of their life at this point, giving up their property, their families. So they just made up the story that Jesus rose from the dead to make themselves feel better and to maybe gain some fame, right? But the apostles, although they did gain prominence, it wasn't the type of prominence one would envy or one would desire. All of them, except for John, who later was exiled, all of the apostles died for their faith. And although many people often die for truths that are just wrong, I think it's worth noting that these are not people that come hundreds or thousands of years later. It's one thing to say that, because a Christian died today for their faith, that means it's true. Well, you're right. It could be the wrong belief. They could be dying for a lie. But the fact that these people, these apostles, and other early Christians had witnessed the very actions of Jesus themselves, and then were willing to die, and none of them were willing to give up their belief, knowing that full well they would be allowed to walk away and live. None of them did that because they really, really believed that Jesus had indeed been raised from the dead. And some people who sort of believe in the conspiracy theory about Jesus is that there's small inconsistencies in the gospel narratives. If you look at historical analyses of the New Testament in particular, all of the sort of when they synthesize the gospel narratives and sort of examine them side by side, and also just the New Testament as a whole, there's the accuracies between 99.5 to 99.8%. So it's almost all completely consistent with each other, and that small percentage it's really irrelevant minor details that may have been lost in the historical shuffle of things. It might have been scribal errors. There's a lot of explanations for that, and even the skeptical biblical scholar Bart Ehrman admits that these inconsistencies are minor and do not undermine the message of the gospel. Now we get to the hallucination theory, and that is that the apostles were just so bereaved and distressed, they were grieving, that they had hallucinations about their beloved rabbi. And this sort of gained prominence in the early 20th century when psychology was kind of an up-and-coming science, and there was more case studies about people who claimed to see loved ones after their death, and that's just a part of the grieving process. However, it's important to note that as of right now, there is no evidence to suggest that mass hallucinations are a common event, which is what would have to be common or even recorded in any sort of psychological literature. And it's important to note that in the Gospels and in the epistles, it's claimed that not only was it seen by one person at a time, which you could maybe discount, or even individuals seeing it by themselves, seeing Jesus by themselves, one could dismiss that reasonably, but on perhaps a dozen occasions to have at one point 500 people see the risen Jesus, and then the apostles without Thomas, and then the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and many other instances. It's simply extremely unlikely that all of these people were hallucinating, not only on various occasions, but in various compositions as to who was actually seeing Jesus. And those that claim that they sort of expected Jesus, the apostles expected Jesus to resurrect, and that's why they began hallucinating, sort of like a confirmation bias. It's very clear in the Gospels that the apostles were completely clueless about Christ's resurrection. They really did not understand. In fact, on some occasions, the bystanders, disciples, or the scribes understood better than the actual apostles themselves what Jesus had claimed. For example, in Matthew's Gospel, after Jesus is crucified, the Pharisees and the chief priests go to Pilate and ask for guards, and in order to guard Jesus' tomb. And what's particularly interesting about that is it seems that the Pharisees and chief priests had more belief in what Jesus claimed to make, and were trying to make sure the apostles didn't steal the body, yet the apostles themselves supposedly expected Jesus to resurrect. If that was the case, why did they flee from sort of when Jesus was arrested, and two, why did they spend about between 40 to 50 days pretty much trapped in the upper room? They locked themselves in the upper room, only very occasionally going out. And that I want to cover another sort of brief side theory that's sort of a combination of a few of these theories here, which is the wrong tomb theory. And the wrong tomb theory is wrong for a few reasons. The first being that given Jesus was a well-known figure among both the authorities and the common person, it would be very unlikely that Jesus would be placed in a place that nobody knew about. And two, to suggest that Jesus' body was moved and then this empty tomb was discovered later, and that's why people thought that Jesus had resurrected. two issues with that. One, the wouldn't the apostles, or at very least Joseph of Arimathea, or the woman, or someone would have known that Jesus' body had been moved. And it wouldn't have made sense for anyone else to move the body, not the Jewish authorities, not the Roman authorities, because, as you can see, it later led to people believing the resurrection. So if the apostles didn't move it, which would force someone to say that, the apostles, these 12 terrified people who had just seen their teacher die, overpowered a Roman guard who would have been executed had they had failed to carry out their mission, just seems very implausible. And even if it was a Jewish guard, as some historians may suggest, due to an ambiguity in the gospel narrative, nonetheless, there were harsh penalties for Jewish guards, as they were, again, subject to the Roman state. So they would have faced severe penalties, likely from the Roman state, but also their own Jewish authorities. So that sort of dismisses the wrong tomb theory. And then sort of the final theory that I think has gained the most prominence in recent years is that the Gospels are just simply a myth, that they are written as sort of fairy tales, folklore, just people were ignorant back then, they didn't understand things, so they just wrote these amazing stories to try to explain them. The apostles weren't historians, so everything is historically unreliable. There's a few problems. So since if one was to claim that the apostles weren't historians, which is indeed true, many of the great historians, such as Thucydides and Herodotus, but particularly Thucydides, were really just average people. Like, maybe they were in the military or they held some sort of minor role in society, but they were by no means these historians who dedicated their lives to studying history. They just liked writing about history, and now we regard them as historians after the fact, but in those times they certainly were not historians, and I think a similar case can be made for the apostles. Not to mention, Luke was very methodical in both his Gospel and Acts of the Apostles because he was a doctor, and he sort of went about things in a very logical order. If one might claim, as earlier was said, that the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus were just symbolic, but once again, that kind of undermines the whole message of the gospel in the first place, and also it's very clear from the phrasing and the words used that this was not a symbolic claim, this is a literal claim. The conflicting narratives, again, the narratives really don't conflict at all, and when they do, they're very minor and insignificant to the message. One that's often pointed to is the number of angels present at the tomb at the resurrection. Some of the accounts, Mark talks about a man being there. John talks about 2 angels. I believe Matthew is also 2 angels, but Luke only includes 1 angel, and people point to that saying, oh look, they couldn't even decide how many angels were there. And that's a really relatively insignificant thing. The fact that they all agree that there were angels there, and the reason Mark refers to angels as sort of these men in white robes, that's how he refers to them. So it's important to look at things in their historical context. But 1, it could have just been, again, a scribal error. 2, there could have been saying that there was 1 angel doesn't discount the possibility that there were 2, and even if they were just simply wrong and there were indeed 2 angels there, or there were 1 when there was claimed 2, that's such a minor thing to get hung up about that I think it's the fact that that's all that one could point to, and as far as an inconsistency in the resurrection narrative, sort of shows how strong the narrative actually is, if that's really one of the main things you could point to. And then the gospel writers weren't even eyewitnesses. I kind of discussed this earlier. That's sort of a dubious claim, but even if it were true, this was from these people were scribes for direct eyewitnesses, so it would be akin to me experiencing the events myself and then having someone write it down for me. It's still my testimony, it's still firsthand, but it's just written by someone secondhand. That doesn't mean that it's not reliable. And as we saw the one that Christianity is formed much later after the resurrection is just entirely untrue. Very early on, Christians believed in the resurrection as soon as it happened, pretty much, and we have, if one doesn't want to accept the gospel narratives, there's certainly archaeological evidence and even extra biblical evidence that Christians believe these things, 50s, 60s AD. But again, Paul's creed in 1 Corinthians is really evidence enough that within 5 years, or obviously potentially much earlier, Christians believed in the resurrection. So this kind of brings me to a final point here. So it seems like there's not really a satisfactory answer with all of these explanations, and I want to get into the explanation I think makes the most logical sense, and that is Christianity. So the resurrection is the only option that takes into account all of these different facts that we know via the testimonies of the gospel and other sources, that there's an empty tomb, no one produced the body of Jesus. All it would have taken was someone, when the apostles claimed that Jesus had resurrected, someone just go to Jesus' tomb and show the body, and that would have been the end of Christianity. I like to make this analogy because I think it's fitting. So I was not around when the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, but say I was, and about 40 days after the event of 9/11, I went around denying, in New York City, I went to New York City, not far from where these events themselves happened, and I just went around saying, 9/11 didn't happen, there's no evidence for it. People would, one, think I was being ridiculous, and two, they'd say, well, if you don't believe it, there are reports of it, and why don't you go see the actual destroyed buildings yourself? And that would be a valid criticism. And think about this. So Jesus was executed in Jerusalem, or technically just outside Jerusalem. But where was the first place that the apostles preached? Does anybody know the first place the apostles preached? Go ahead, Dr. Raub.
Jerusalem?
Yeah. So they were preaching in the very place that these events took place, at the very maximum, 40 days after the events took place. Because after 40 days, Jesus ascended into heaven. Why would the apostles go and preach this sort of idea if there were people right there who had just seen this guy die, right? They just saw Jesus die. Many of them didn't believe. They had no reason to cover up for the Christians. They would have just gone and got the body. And trust me, the Roman or Jewish authorities, they would have done the same thing, which is why in Matthew's gospel we see there's this little anecdote, this little story, that the Pharisees and the chief priests and the scribes, they all go to the guard, whether it was Roman or Jewish is sort of irrelevant, and they say, go report that the apostles stole the body, we'll cover for you. And that sort of makes us imply that it was a Roman guard. But even if it was a Jewish guard, that means that they admit that there was an empty tomb. There was no body. So if there's an empty tomb, Christianity takes that into account. The apostles claimed to see Jesus. Even if they didn't, according to those other more skeptical views, this accounts for that they actually did. Maybe they were actually seeing Jesus. They were transformed. They died for Christ, like I said. They were transformed in the sense, especially James and Paul. These were two skeptical people. So James, sort of, depending on your translation, maybe the half-brother or the cousin of Jesus, he was convinced of the resurrection, despite in the gospel narrative rebuking Jesus himself, saying, "This guy's a lunatic." Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians, completely turns around and becomes pretty much the greatest evangelizer Christianity has ever seen. The apostles, again, preached in that place where Jesus died. The Romans didn't butcher executions. Jesus' tomb was guarded by the Roman guards, or maybe Jewish guards. There was a massive rock there. It wouldn't have been easy for just anybody to move it. And it was Jesus' tomb was a known tomb. So that kind of discounts all the other theories. So it seems like Christianity is the most logical option. So what does that mean? And this is sort of the conclusion of this talk. And what does it mean for us if Jesus really did resurrect? So it means Jesus has saved us from death, our sin. We've been saved from our sins. And all we need to do is to make the choice to take up our cross and follow Christ. So to have faith, to live in accord with His will, with His laws, and to follow His holy church. And we will be able to rejoice and enjoy the fruits of Christ's resurrection in heaven with Him for eternity. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day.